Let's talk about how we're going to structure your Common App essay. So there are four different ways of structuring your essay. And so one very traditional and three sort of outside the box. So you just got to think about what your topic is and which of the four structures might fit best with yours. So remember, we're writing a personal narrative, and a narrative sounds like it's a story, but it's not really a story. So I don't want like foreshadowing or characters or dialogue or plot. It's not like a short story, but you're still telling a story. Does that make sense? So we're going to write in first person, and you might anchor to one anecdote, maybe a pair of anecdotes or stories. But what's happening is cryptically within your story that you're telling me, you're going to be telling us about who you are, what your strengths are, maybe what you're passionate about, might even relate to your major, may not, and how you're going to contribute as a member of the freshman class. It's all kind of cryptically underneath the story that you're telling. So yeah, it doesn't sound easy at all, and it isn't. It's a tough one. So the very first form that you might write in is what we call a linear form. And this is the very traditional form. Linear, think of it like a line. So you open up with an introduction that doesn't directly kind of state your point, but it kind of introduces the topic itself. And you're not going to make it into keyholes. So you're not going to have some kind of here are my three reasons body paragraph sort of structure. No, what I'd rather you do is I'd rather you opt for very logical, very natural progression of your ideas. One idea built upon the next idea, which leads to eventually to a conclusion. So in a sense, it makes a line. And therefore, when we get to the very end, we reach a more thoughtful point at the very, very end. So any of the 7 prompts would work for this, where basically you are just simply going from beginning to end and telling your story. So this works really well if you have one strong single story that you want to tell, one single anecdote. If it's really good for like a piece about like who you were and who you are now, a piece about transformation. If you have one specific activity or one specific quality that you want to showcase and you want to explain why you find that to be valuable, this is a great form for that. So I have a couple examples online. The best one I have is one called I Can't Wait for the 4th of July. I like this one because it moves very chronologically and it gives very specific details that are going to accent the student's intelligence and also his ambitions. And I also like how it kind of hints that he has a potential majoring in chemistry and engineering, because you can kind of hear that. He doesn't like kind of shove it down your throat, but you can hear that that's where his interests lie. Now, the next 3 types of forms are a little bit more tricky, a little bit more advanced. So this one's probably the hardest one. We call this a delayed or an anticipated thesis. This is what you did for writing number 2. So this is when you write with the intention of arriving at a final, more poignant example. So you state it right at the beginning, but then you delay writing about it. Think about how we wrote in our semantics pieces, how you introduced something, you walked away from it, and then you came back at the very end and you hinted it. It's a little different, but this is pretty close to what we did there. So you're going to layer your paper with other examples that are going to foreshadow this final example that you want to present to us at the very end. So once again, you kind of hint at something, you anticipate it, then you step away, you start writing about other examples, and then we eventually come back to that initial example that you hinted at. But the reader can kind of foretell this is what's going to occur, and they can understand your point because they start seeing how all the examples all start relating to each other. And then eventually we get to the final example and your best example. You're like, oh, I see how this all fits. It's a very sophisticated way of writing, but it's a fun one. And so I don't necessarily need a big conclusion at the end, because oftentimes your final example is your conclusion. So you put a lot of trust in the reader to kind of follow this style. It's different, but different might be good. So this works really well with prompts number 1, 2, and 6. So if you have one common trait or one common interest, this piece works really well. If you have lots of multiple examples, but you have one that's really more important or more poignant or more intriguing than the others, one that really stands out, this one also works really well for that. If you have an anecdote or a story that you could kind of tell a little bit of very abruptly and then move away from it and then come back and finish it later, this is a really good form for that particular structure. So I have 2 examples of this online for you. The one I want to showcase to you is one called Leadership in All Circumstances. And what's happening is in this piece, the author, she begins by hinting at her final anecdote, which is this missions trip that she's on. And she's writing about this missions trip, and then she walks away from it at the very beginning, and then she starts giving other examples of leadership that she had been challenged with throughout her high school years. And then when she gets back to the end and she gets back to this missions trip, you're like, okay, I see how in this missions trip she's able to succeed because she has shown leadership earlier in her years at high school. So therefore, this new challenge on this mission trip isn't much of a challenge anymore because she's dealt with these kind of issues before and she knows how to tackle it. It's a really good example of the delayed or anticipated thesis. The third one you have is what we call the interrupted form. In interrupted form, another one that's kind of challenging. I think these two middle ones are the most challenging, where you're going to focus on one single story, one single anecdote. It could be anything, an experience on a mission trip, for example. But right in the middle of telling your story, you break. And right in the middle of your story, you break away and you kind of go somewhere else, something that might be informative or factual. And then all of a sudden, when you interrupt the flow of this narrative, and when you step back in and finish the story, we're like, wait a minute, you kind of did like a weird sidestep to kind of tell us about something else, and then you came back and finished the story. But what happens then is we come back and finish the narrative, we see how those two ideas connect. Like, oh, I see why you sidestepped, did something else, and then came back and finished that story. So in a sense, you're interrupting the flow of a single story with something else. And I don't necessarily need like a clear conclusion, because oftentimes that little sidestep, and we can hear how that actually works with the main story, and we get the point. So you don't necessarily have to overstate something. This is a very understated, very sophisticated way of writing as well. This works for all 7 prompts. So if you have one anecdote or one particular interest you want to highlight, if you figure out a way that you can juxtapose, meaning kind of butt right next to the other one, so you kind of butt these two things together, a certain quality, or maybe it's sometimes you put a weakness next to a strength. That's a really cool quality, like really cool thing to do in your writing. If you're trying to show growth or perseverance, this is another good one to kind of use the interrupted form. So the best example, and sometimes I think just to be looking at examples kind of explains it a little better than what I can do, is one called Vitamin C. In Vitamin C, the author is going to write about her hobby of scuba diving. So she writes about this hobby of scuba diving, and then about halfway through writing about scuba diving, she sidesteps and she interrupts this piece with her weakness, which is her anxiety, something that she suffers with. And then when she returns and completes her story about scuba diving, you realize how the two kind of connect. Even though they're complete opposites, you realize this girl who has this strength of putting on this scuba gear rather, going underneath the water, also suffers from anxiety, but also shows that she's been able to overcome that with this other strength. Not that she's fixed it, but she's been able to sort of battle that anxiety. And so I like that. It's a really good example of the interrupted form. Lastly, and probably the most popular one that you all choose will be number 4, which is called layered examples. So this is really different from number 1, where number 1, linear form, is about one story that you want to tell. And if you don't have one great story you want to tell, maybe you have a bunch of little stories that all relate to the same theme. And so layered examples is usually what I get a lot of, and I think it's fine. So maybe you have a bunch of shorter examples that all either lead to one main example, or they just simply all relate to the same theme. All right, so you may not necessarily have one main example, but they all kind of relate to the same theme over and over and over again. And so therefore, you might have a final conclusive paragraph that kind of wraps them all together to say, hey, do you see how these all relate to the same theme about who I am? You might have just one big example at the end, which avoids the necessity of having a final paragraph. So some possibilities. So once again, this is nice if you don't have one strong example, but you have a bunch of short examples that anchor to maybe one strength or one quality or one interest. And therefore, it kind of shows a nice little variety of edges. So most people fall into this category because they may not necessarily have one really great story from their lives, but they realize they have a bunch of stories that all relate to a certain quality: your creativity, your perseverance, your strength, your faith, your ingenuity, whatever it might be. So I have one piece called Risky Business. And this piece, the whole thing is all about the idea of like this student likes to take risks. And so he provides a number of short examples of his risk taking, and so the whole piece is just layered with a bunch of examples that by the end of it you're like, okay, I remember this kid because he was very risky, and he gave a lot of memorable examples, very detailed. And that's what I think is really good about this piece, is instead of drifting into very general examples, he gives very specific examples. So even though he gives a lot of examples, they're still memorable, because sometimes when you give a lot of examples, you can forget them. But he gives so many good examples, but they're memorable because you realize he's very specific. And so this is a really good example of this. All right, that's all. So our goal now is to think about what we're going to write about and what would be the right form or the best form to fit with that particular topic. When you look at the folder, you'll find that the example essays that I noted in this slide will be there for you, and as well as some other examples of the same form, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. All right, so read a few before you maybe start jumping into figuring out what you want to write on.